This is topic 1, and what we're going to do today is talk a little about two sort of main definitions and then some sub-definitions that will help us understand those two main definitions. So the first big topic that we're going to talk about are what are known as variables. And a variable is a characteristic, let's say, of a person or thing that is assigned a number or category. And so I think one of the key things about the word variable is just thinking about the English sort of language definition of what variable means. It means it's something that can possibly change, right? So as we start to record a variable, it should be something that has multiple possible outcomes. It doesn't mean that everyone will have a different outcome, but it's something that could, in theory, change as we would go from sort of person to person or thing to thing, depending on what we're recording. And before I give an example, the other sort of key definition that we need that goes along with variable, and it's important these two things go together, are what are known as our observational units. And so we can't really talk about a variable without knowing what observational units we're talking about. We might be recording that variable on. So observational units are those persons or things that we're recording the data on. So, for example, we might have observational units that are all students at Southwestern, right? That might be an observational unit. And if you think about all students at Southwestern, there are many variables we could record about students at Southwestern. We could record their age. We could record their height. We could record their grade level. Those are all things that we could record. Similarly, we could think of observational units as maybe all movies ever made, and we could record the length of the movie, whether or not it's won an Oscar, things like that. So those are the two things. They come in pairs. We generally talk about observational units, so what are the things that we're recording information about, and then the variables. What variables are we recording about those observational units? So those are the things that we're going to look at today. I'll give a couple of examples to talk about things that are variables and those things that aren't, as well as what observational units we might be looking at. Now, let's look at an example. So let's go back to the idea of observational units maybe being, let's say, all movies. So maybe every movie ever made. Okay, and so if we start thinking about variables, you could maybe even start, I think I mentioned a couple in the last slide, but you can maybe start thinking of things we could record about a given movie. So if we were thinking about things that are variables, we could think of things like the length of the movie. We can talk about whether or not it's won an Oscar. And maybe, let's see, it's one other variable that we could think about maybe that has something we record about the movie, maybe the director of the movie, right? Those are all things that we could record. The length of the movie, the director, and whether or not the movie has won an Oscar. So those are all things that would vary from movie to movie. And certainly some of those movies could have the same answer, right? Like if we took maybe two movies that are directed by Clint Eastwood, they would have the same director, but it's still possible that we could take a third movie, right, and they would have a different director. So they're all things that could vary. So all of these, we would say, are certainly going to be something that would be a variable, for sure. But the question is, now, can we think of examples maybe where we're still talking about movies, but something that would not be a variable? So for example, something that's not a variable would be like the 1998 Oscar winner for Best Picture. Right, that would be an example that's not a variable. It is one movie, right? Whatever movie won the Oscar for Best Picture in 1998 is the one and only movie that won that prize. So that's not a variable. It's not something that's going to change from person to person. So when you're asking a question about whether something's a variable or not, it needs to have something that could possibly be different as you go from observational unit to observational unit. So just think about that when you're asked a question about whether something is a variable or not. Ask yourself, if I went to each observational unit, whatever that may be. In this case, it's movies. And if I went to each movie and asked, what is the 1998 Oscar Best Picture? Each movie should give me the same answer because there is one and only one answer. So that's something to think about as you think about whether or not something is a variable. Is it something that could change, or is there just one answer that is the answer is a thing? There's one final thing we need to know about variables, and that is sort of thinking about whether those variables are quantitative or categorical. You'll also hear quantitative versus qualitative, a different thing, maybe numerical. There are different words that you sort of will hear with this, but our book is going to use quantitative and categorical. So a variable is quantitative, so we were talking about variables. And so we talk about a quantitative variable is anything that deals with a number. So if you're calculating a number that has a specific meaning and sort of a number line, if you want to think about it that way, so it deals with a number sort of on a number line. It has some sort of meaning in terms of its order. That would be what we know as a quantitative variable. A variable that's categorical, on the other hand, that's something that sort of fits into a group, or in other words, a category. And so those are the things you can think about when you think about variables that are quantitative versus categorical. Is we're talking about things that are either groups or categories, or things that are specific numbers that have a numerical meaning and actually have a value. So we'll look at some examples based maybe on the movie example we just did and talk about maybe the differences between quantitative and categorical variables. Okay, so let's return to our movies example, remembering that movies are observational units, and let's look at the three variables we talked about on the last slide. So we talked about length of a movie. So we talk about the length of a movie, right? So let's say the movie is 2 hours and 10 minutes. Then that's a quantitative variable, right? It has a specific value as a numerical value, and it has meaning. 2 hours and 10 minutes, right, as a specific time length that might be then longer than a movie that's or longer than a movie that's like an hour and a half. So this is definitely a quantitative variable. Won an Oscar or not. So if we're thinking about that, we want to think about whether it's won an Oscar or not. So if you think about the answer to that, the answer is either yes or no. It is not a number. It's not asking how many Oscars the movie won. It's just, did it win an Oscar of some sort or not? So that is a specific categorical variable. And then director, again, if we're asking the director of the movie, there might be multiple directors, but certainly there's at least one director, and that's a category. Again, it's certainly not a number, but it's certainly a category. So again, what you actually are noticing here, right, is that you can actually phrase these sometimes. So won an Oscar or not would be categorical, but sort of number of Oscars won, that would be now a numerical, a quantitative variable. Right? So that's sort of a subtle difference between categorical and quantitative, is how you phrase things, right? So you can often get a quantitative variable if you want one, just thinking about the way that you phrase it. So those are the differences. Quantitative, looking for numbers; categorical, looking for specific categories of things. The only other slight thing that you might hear mentioned in the text is what's known as a binary categorical variable, and those are ones that only have two categories. So for example, in our 3 or 4 examples up here, this example right here on wanting an Oscar or not, right? That's a binary categorical category or variable because it only has two options. It's either yes or no. Another great example of a binary categorical variable is when you flip a coin, right? Either it lands on heads or tails. So these are all things that you want to think about when you're looking at variables, is knowing whether you have a quantitative or categorical variable. And that's going to be really important as we move on, because that's really the first thing you have to decide when we start doing statistics, is do I have something that's quantitative or do I have something that's categorical? And that's how we decide what kind of statistics we're going to run. I think I want to make one quick more note, or last note, about variables and how you sort of define them. So if we are going to go back to that example, I think we talked about all students at Southwestern. Maybe that's our observational unit. Then if we want to talk about variables, you have to be very careful how you phrase them. So age is certainly a variable you could record. That would be great. But you can't really say statistics, right? For example, that's not a variable as it's written. You can say, like, whether or not they've taken statistics. That is an okay variable. But statistics by itself is not a variable, doesn't mean anything. So just one more thing, when you're thinking about creating variables or describing a variable, make sure it isn't something that does in fact vary and it's not just a word that has no specific meaning. So that's the last thing you want to think about as you think about variables.